Thank you for tuning in to the Practical Preservation Podcast. Please take a moment to visit our website, practicalpreservationservices.com, for additional information and tips to help you restore your historical home. If you've not done so, please subscribe to us on iTunes, Stitcher, or SoundCloud, and also like us on Facebook. Welcome to the Practical Preservation Podcast, hosted by Danielle and Jonathan Kepperling. Kepperling Preservation Services is a family-owned business based in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, dedicated to the preservation of our built architectural history for today's use as well as future generations. Our weekly podcast provides you with expert advice specific to the unique needs of renovating a historic home, educating by sharing our From the Trenches preservation knowledge and our guests' expertise, balancing modern needs while maintaining the historical significance, character, and beauty of your period home.
Today on the Practical Preservation Podcast, we have Alyssa Frystak with us from PlaceEconomics. Thank you for joining me today.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me, Danielle.
So tell me about your background.
Yeah, sure. So I kind of took a little bit of a circuitous path to preservation. Although I think it was something that was always an interest of mine, even before I knew what preservation actually was.
Right.
Growing up, my family was what we call heritage tourists. We always made a point to go to destinations that had, a rich cultural history and opportunities for us to learn, be that through tours or museums, things like that. And then in fifth grade, my teacher actually lived in a Sears kit home that was part of an annual house tour in our town.
Mm-hmm.
And so she was really involved with the old house community. And she actually set up a class field trip for us to go to the local historical society, which I just found fascinating. I remember coming home from school that day and just rattling on for days to whoever would listen about how cool that field trip was. So I think early on, I was kind of instilled with this desire to learn about history through experiencing place.
Yes.
But apart from that curiosity, I actually had a career right out of high school as a professional ballet dancer. So I spent 6 years dancing with various companies in the Midwest, getting to perform on some really beautiful and historic stages. But then I sustained, what would become a career-ending injury. And after that happened, I kind of needed to figure out what my next step was. And all of those architecture tours growing up had kind of stuck with me, and it was still an interest of mine. And so I decided that I wanted to become an architect. And so I went back to school first at a community college where I took some architectural history courses and drafting courses. And then I enrolled at the University of Illinois at Chicago in their architectural studies program. But somewhere along the way, I kind of figured out that what I really wanted to do didn't involve designing new buildings, but studying old ones. And being in Chicago, part of an urban campus and seeing firsthand not only the amazing older housing stock, but also witnessing firsthand the housing affordability crisis. I ended up writing my undergraduate capstone on the intersection of historic preservation and affordable housing.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. And that kind of that interest continued on. After UIC, I went on to grad school at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, where I earned a master's in historic preservation. And while I was at SAIC, I continued my research into affordable housing and preservation. And so that was, again, the topic of my master's thesis. But I also, during that time, kind of started to get interested in learning how I could start measuring the impacts of preservation, especially as it pertained to housing. It was, my initial goal was to kind of use that learning of how to measure things as part of my thesis. And of course, while I was doing that research for housing, I became familiar with PlaceEconomics and the former Preservation Green Lab. And I knew that GIS was a big part of how they conducted their research. So while I was still in grad school at SAIC, I enrolled in a GIS certificate program at my alma mater, UIC. And yeah, kind of one thing led to another. And that experience using data and using GIS was kind of what ultimately brought me to work at PlaceEconomics in 2019. So.
That's very interesting. And I think most people don't think of, historic housing or historic buildings and affordable housing. So I think that's interesting that you put those together, even in your undergraduate. But for listeners that maybe aren't familiar, what is the GIS?
Yeah, so GIS is Geographic Information Systems. So it's basically a really fancy term for mapping. And what's really unique about GIS is that we're able to spatialize data. So, we're able, a lot of the work that we do, especially when you're beginning to learn how to use GIS, is looking at census data and assigning it to census blocks or census tracts, which, I think a lot of people are familiar with the concept of census tracts. And so it's really kind of bringing a spatial component to understand data, which, at PlaceEconomics and, other research firms like that, it's really a large part of how we look at and interpret, analysis and questions that we have. So, yeah.
I know I think it's a similar system that our county uses for our property records, and then each municipality has an overlay on that. So I get into that with zoning. I don't look at it for data.
Exactly. Yeah. And a lot of times too, what we're doing is we go to the county's website and we go to their open data portals, and we're able to download, for free, zoning shape files or, parcel shape files and things like that. So yeah, a lot of times it is stuff, especially the census stuff, is all available for free online. But unfortunately, GIS isn't super user friendly. So it takes someone who knows how to use it to be able to actually interpret
to get some good data.
And use it the right way. So
I think you kind of explained, what drew you into preservation. Is there anything that you wanted to add to that?
I think it's just this concept of collective memory has always really drawn me in, especially, and that this historic fabric is something that kind of helps us, formulate our own personal individual experience and also form our cultural identity and stuff. And that's just kind of always been just so cool to me, the fact that I can stand somewhere in someone's house that, helped found the country, or, even, sites of civil rights, protest or things like it's just so fascinating that we can, be in one place and be experiencing something that happened, a long time ago. It just kind of, that continuum of history is just so fascinating to me. Yeah. So
I agree with you. I really I love to, when you said you were a heritage tourist, I'm like, that's what I am too. Somebody was talking about going someplace. I'm like, oh, I always wanted to go to Charleston. And they're like, why? I said, architecture. And they're like, do you ever not work?
Yeah, seriously. I have a friend's bachelorette party coming up, and we're going to Nashville, and she was asking us what we wanted to do. And I was like, well, can we get a behind the scenes tour of the Ryman? I'm constantly thinking of when I'm in a new place, constantly trying to figure out places to go where I can still be, it's a lifestyle, it's not just a profession, it's a lifestyle. So
I agree.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about PlaceEconomics as the firm.
Yeah. So PlaceEconomics is a Washington, D.C. based private research firm that's situated at the intersection of historic preservation and economics. So we mainly serve municipal historic preservation offices. Sometimes we serve state historic preservation offices or statewide Main Street coordinating programs. And sometimes we also serve local or statewide nonprofit historic preservation organizations. And we mainly conduct research at both the local or citywide level. as well as the statewide level. And additionally, we sometimes have international clients that we do, policy development work for as well. And so we pride ourselves on specializing in both the qualitative and quantitative sides. So on the qualitative side, that might be, studying the demographics of a historic district, looking at catalytic impacts of investment that was the result of a grant program, looking at how many jobs were created from historic tax credit activity, and kind of one that every client wants to know is for us to look at like patterns of property value change in historic districts as well. But we also know that data doesn't tell the full story alone. So we really like to talk to people on the ground and conduct interviews that ultimately end up as sidebar stories in our reports. And those really do help demonstrate like the human side of what we're finding in our data. But then apart from those quantitative kind of metrics, we also do a lot of policy research and development. So, a lot of times our clients are not only interested about, in the economic and social and cultural ecosystem that we study in our qualitative side of things, but they are also interested in learning about policy and strategies that might, either solve a problem that they're experiencing or maximize the economic benefits of preservation for their community. So for that, we carry out like extensive stakeholder engagement so that we can understand what the community wants and needs are. And then we kind of use that plus our own, extensive knowledge of domestic and international best practices to kind of help inform the recommendations that we also, we offer to clients.
For as like your conclusions in your reports.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's kind of interpreting what we hear during those stakeholder engagements, coupled with, all of the reading and research that we do at the domestic and international level to kind of formulate those. So, yeah.
That's very interesting. So I know when I reached out to you, I had seen some posts that you, or maybe they were articles that you had written about two different topics. So I asked you if you would talk about both of those during the podcast today. So talk to me a little bit about what deconstruction is.
Yeah. So deconstruction was something that was kind of a new concept to our firm, even just as recent as a year ago. But around that time is when the Office of Historic Preservation in San Antonio came to us because they were curious about the kinds of impacts that enacting a deconstruction ordinance would have on their city. They were actually trying to get an ordinance passed at the time, and they kind of needed a little bit more data and ammunition to provide to elected officials. Mm-hmm. And so at PlaceEconomics, like we're always up for a challenge, and we're always really curious. And so we kind of also realized that this was a topic that was probably going to be important in the future of preservation. So we agreed to take on the assignment. And it really ended up being a great opportunity for us to do some research and development and pushed us to learn new methodologies of measurement. So
I'm sorry to interrupt. I was just thinking, were you concerned about the like the impact on like the waste, like the in the trash cycles? Is that what you focused on? Or that's what
we were interested in kind of learning a little bit more about how much could be kept out of the waste stream if a deconstruction ordinance had been passed. And so to get back a little bit to like what deconstruction is, deconstruction is the process of dismantling structures component by component, basically in the reverse order in which they were installed. And the goal of this is to harvest materials to be salvaged. And since it requires much more like skill than typical mechanical demolition, it's usually undertaken by a specialized deconstruction contractor. But because the materials are removed in such a careful manner, they're able to be reused, whether that be in, other construction projects, or they are also upcycled into new like value added products like furniture and things like that. But obviously we know that not every building can be saved. But those instances when a building has to come down, we've really kind of come to believe that deconstruction provides many more benefits than traditional demolition would. So we're big fans now.
Yeah. Well, and I do some consulting work for our local preservation group in Lancaster, and there was a building that we found out, after it had been approved, after it had gone through the approval process to be demolished. So we approached the township to ask them if they would at least encourage them to salvage what they could, because there was a barn. There's a lot of materials that can be salvaged from a barn.
Right.
There's and they were actually open to it. So we felt like, it wasn't what we wanted, but at least it was a little bit of a victory.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then you can come back and say, this doesn't have to be a one-off thing. Like we can be doing this a lot, it can become common practice,
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And I think it's interesting about the cities codifying that into their demolition ordinances, because I think from it's very sustainable. It's a very, it's a very green practice. And the first municipality that I looked at, and I don't know if you looked at it when you were doing your study, that I was aware that had done it was Portland, Oregon. Were they the first, or that you're aware of? Or
I don't quote me on it, but I think that they were. Yeah. And they've kind of expanded their ordinance over time as well to like start including more buildings on, what gets deconstructed. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I agree. I think it's definitely part of this larger, I think we've come to realize that the linear waste stream has been really detrimental and had some really bad effects on our planet. And as we move forward, grappling with climate change and sea level rise and like all these other existential crises that we're facing, we're starting to realize that we need more sustainable practices. And so I think deconstruction is kind of situated in this other, shift to the circular waste economy movement, circular economy models where things are used and then reused and recirculated in the economy in these like closed loops. And so deconstruction kind of fits and is well situated within that circular economy model. And there's plenty of, there's a lot of cities across the country, like you mentioned, Portland, San Jose, Palo Alto, Madison, Wisconsin. They're all, kind of starting to make shifts and codify this stuff. Yeah. And, we were really pleasantly surprised to learn that our San Antonio deconstruction report was the final push that was needed for the mayor of Pittsburgh to sign an executive order to instate a deconstruction policy. So it's really a movement that's kind of happening all over the country, and we really, really love to see it. So
that's exciting. Yeah. I think that it should be incorporated more, because there's a lot that can be salvaged from a building, and it doesn't need to be thrown away.
Yeah.
So I remember probably 15 years ago, I read the Restoration Economy book. Mm-hmm. And I think it's like 20 to 30% of our waste is just construction waste. Right. And that to me is just crazy, but I can believe it. Like I see dumpsters rolling off of construction sites and full of stuff.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And it's not only does so much of that, of what's in landfills is made up of C&D waste. It's also, deconstruction also just provides a lot of opportunities for jobs and for an increase in labor income, and when it's a local deconstruction crew who's undertaking these projects, that they're going out and they're spending that increased labor income in the local economy. And that's like really good for the local dynamics of an economy.
When you started to say the job, I thought, oh yeah, these are local jobs, just like preservation jobs. Yeah, they're local. They can't be outsourced.
Right.
You need people to do that work. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And it not only provides, jobs on site, but it also provides like warehouse jobs and retail and sales jobs. Because a lot of times these materials end up going to like a local restore,
Right.
kind of place. And so, it really, it multiplies the number of jobs. If you're on a demolition site, there's like 2 guys working and they're there for like 2 to 3 days. Right. And then that's it. And then that goes to a landfill. But in deconstruction, it's a much larger crew that's needed. It's a very like skilled, labor force that needs to be used, and they're there for, possibly like 3 weeks even,
Right.
So it's really, and then that material goes on to have another life, which, creates all these other jobs. So it's really interesting to kind of see like the ripple effect that deconstruction can have in a community.
Yeah. Very, very interesting. I'm excited that that's kind of gaining traction, and so, and I think I think that there needs to be more conversation about the intersection between, sustainability and preservation. And this is just another way to kind of extend that. So then the other topic that we had, that I had seen that you were writing about, was that you had brought up before about affordable housing in relation to older buildings. So talk to me about that.
Yeah, that could honestly be a whole nother podcast, especially because that's something that, I've been a personal interest, and also now a PlaceEconomics, a research interest of mine for years and years. But so I think first I kind of want to talk a little bit and break this down, the preservation and affordable housing, using an analogy that I think preservationists are familiar with. And a lot of times preservation is seen in terms of like uppercase P preservation and lowercase p preservation, right? Where uppercase preservation is signified by like high style, buildings and formal designation. And lowercase preservation is the act of just, keeping older, often vernacular, non-designated buildings standing. And I think it's really important to see that affordable housing can kind of be seen using that same analogy. So uppercase affordable housing, uses tax credits and incentives and deep subsidies to provide affordable housing.
Right.
Whereas lowercase affordable housing doesn't really rely on subsidies, but rather the owner's ability to like rehab and maintain their building in an economic manner, right? This kind of like lowercase affordable housing is often what we refer to as naturally occurring affordable housing. And I think preservationists have long believed that, older non-designated housing, AKA lower preservation, lowercase preservation, is already providing unsubsidized affordable housing, AKA lowercase affordable housing in their communities. And so we at PlaceEconomics, again, were approached by the San Antonio Office of Historic Preservation, and they kind of wanted us to explore this theory a little bit more. They were mainly concerned with understanding how lowercase preservation of older non-designated buildings was providing lowercase affordable housing. And so for that study, rather than looking only at historic districts and comparing those against the rest of the city, which is our typical model that we use for our methodology, we ended up creating a study area that consisted of the census block groups in which the majority of the housing units were built prior to 1960. So we were more interested in just knowing like, where is older housing? And, within those study block groups, we kind of had a couple of questions we wanted to answer, which was, we just kind of wanted to understand the characteristics of that older housing, as well as, the demographics of the people who were living there. And we also wanted to look at the rent levels and the owner costs and property values in those areas to see if those older units were actually serving an affordable housing need. and the pattern that we found kind of confirmed what like especially the Office of Historic Preservation in San Antonio knew, was that these older undesignated housing units were disproportionately serving Hispanic residents and lower income residents, and really consisted of long-term homeowners. And so, those were the characteristics of the people who lived there. But we also found that the owner costs and the renter costs were lower in these areas as well. But apart from that, so it's lower cost to live there. We know that it's serving communities that really need it. But we also found that property levels or property value levels in those areas were also appreciating at a much higher and faster rate than the rest of the city.
That's interesting.
Yeah, which we realized like that puts them at a greater risk of becoming tear downs.
Right.
And so, we kind of realized that it's more cost effective and a better investment to invest resources in those older housing units rather than, and so that people can actually stay there and live there and not get displaced.
Right.
Rather than just kind of letting the market do what it's doing, and eventually those people will get pushed out because there's a lot of tear downs, and then once something's torn down, it's a much larger unit and most likely not going to be affordable. So yeah, it was kind of a cycle that we wanted to prove what was happening, and then also prove what risk they were at as well.
Right.
So.
And then do you offer like not a solution, but do you offer recommendations, or do you kind of just turn that over to the Office of Historic Preservation and let them kind of come up with like maybe policies?
No, we did give some recommendations for San Antonio, and I think that they're starting to work towards some of those. I know a deconstruction ordinance was actually one of the things that we had suggested, because deconstruction, demolition is visually traumatic to a community. Right. And so we also found that demolitions were happening a lot more in these areas that were housing majority minority and low income communities. And so deconstruction at least offers a little bit less traumatic removal, but It also provides materials then that can be recirculated for a little bit more affordable costs back into the community, so that people who are living there, who maybe have a little bit of maintenance that needs to be done on their property, they can be replacing like with like at a little bit more of an affordable cost, than going to Home Depot or a hardware store and getting those kind of stock materials. So
yeah, and they match. I mean, I know our we live in a duplex, and our neighbors were getting rid of the French doors between the living room and the dining room, and we didn't have ours, so we went and got theirs.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's keeping things in use, like the energy that we use to create those materials doesn't get lost then. And if you can find windows out in a back alley somewhere and take them, like that stops them from going to landfill. You're getting them for free. You can, it's a lot more economical for you to be able to maintain a home if it's something that's already, come out of another building. So, yeah.
So, what are the common misconceptions about preservationists?
Yeah. So I think one of the biggest misconceptions about preservation and preservationists in general is that we're opposed to progress and change, right?
Yeah. I've heard that too.
Oh yeah, it's something that like we're accused of all the time. Yeah. And part of that is a communication problem that is kind of plaguing our field. Part of it is a lot of the general public, either not understanding what we do or seeing what we do as not relevant, which is also an issue as well. But something that we've been doing at PlaceEconomics might start to kind of dispel those myths about preservationists. one of our New Year's resolutions at PlaceEconomics was to reinstate something that we had started years ago, which was our Pres Polls. And our Pres Polls are surveys on preservation kind of current issues that we push out to our preservation professionals network through various media channels and stuff like that. And so especially the last 3 that we've done, we've kind of learned a lot. The last 3 were on deconstruction, affordable housing, and ADUs, accessory dwelling units.
Yeah.
And so we found through those surveys that an overwhelming majority of preservation professionals support, these forward-thinking measures that, for things like allowing construction of ADUs in historic districts and neighborhoods, implementing policies and measures that protect existing affordable housing, and deconstruction mandates that call for recycling and reuse, things like that. So I think a lot of what these survey results have shown us is that preservationists kind of no longer fit that like NIMBY stereotype that we're like so often assigned, but that the majority of us now, especially I'd say the younger generations, we actively want to engage with these issues, and we want to start thinking of more flexible approaches to preservation. And, we want to be part of major issues like climate change and housing and social equity and stuff like that. So I think at least we're doing our little part to kind of figure out where preservationists stand on these issues and kind of dispel some of those myths and rumors about us.
I think that's great. Because I do, like, I in our neighborhood, we have a large hospital, and they were wanting to tear down 2 buildings. And there was like it was over Zoom. There was a neighborhood Zoom, to talk about it. And the one guy kept saying, why are you trying to stop them from doing, and I'm like, nobody's trying to stop them. They can incorporate, there's a lot of things they could do besides tear these buildings down. And he just kept saying it. And finally I'm like, no, nobody said that. Like, stop. Like,
exactly. Yeah. And I think, that's a problem that I think a lot of preservationists face, right? Like, it's all happening at the local level, and there's a lot of like local politics involved. There's a lot of like hands in the pot. And I think, when we say we don't want something, it's taken that we don't want anything to happen.
Right.
And then that's not really the case. It's like, no, we want to make sure that the resources are still there. And we also want to make sure that whatever development happens is done in a sensitive manner, and there's plenty of options other than just tearing it down because you think that that's the easiest thing to do. So, So I was like, I just, that I hadn't gone to a lot of public, local community meetings. That like really took me back when he was like, why are you trying to stop all the progress? I'm like, nobody said that. Stop. So what trends or challenges do you see in preservation? Yeah, and I think there's, a challenge that I see is kind of a little bit aligned to what we've kind of just been talking about, right? Is that I think we're seen as very reactive rather than proactive in situations that involve, historic or, just older resources. And so I think it's really important for preservationists to build relationships with those outside of our field. I think part of that communication and education problem with the general public is that we're just really siloed. And so, if we're building those relationships outside our field, when discussions are being had and when decisions are being made, we're not only in the loop then, but we already have a seat at the table, right? Like they already know to include us. They already know that we are the people they should be talking to with regards to older buildings.
Right.
And I think that would be a really huge step in the right direction, and kind of making sure that we're part of those conversations and that our opinions are heard and respected. and stuff like
Right.
that. And
And I think some of that, I think having a seat at the table is very important, but I think that some of the, like you were talking about, like accessory buildings in a historic district, like
Mhm.
that to me, and that to me doesn't seem like it would be a huge issue, because you're not hurting the building at all. Like you're just adding something in the yard. Like,
Right.
you know what I mean? So like I think that sometimes preservationists need to be a little bit practical too with their recommendations. When you have that seat at the table, you can't just be like, no, I need to have everything my way, or you have to be able to give a little bit that's, and be a little bit practical.
Right, exactly. And I think, for me at least, I'm kind of one of those preservationists who thinks like if something is still standing, that's a win.
Right.
Like it doesn't need, in my opinion, to have, perfect windows that match exactly with what was there before.
Right.
If that building is still in productive use and it's providing a need for the community, then that's a win.
Yeah.
And especially with like accessory dwelling units, like a lot of times in historic districts, like they're already there, they're
Right.
carriage houses, their garages, their
Yeah.
basement units, like, so they're already there, and they don't, at all take away from the historic nature of the community and stuff like
Right.
that. It's just, we just want a little bit of control over, if you're putting in a new one, maybe what it looks like, so that it at least
Right.
blends in a little
Yeah.
bit, but other than that, like we are all for, increasing density in already, dense neighborhoods, which are
Right.
historic districts. So, yeah.
No, yeah, I know that sometimes that's another, I think, and maybe it goes along with the same idea, but like that, like, if you let the preservationists have a seat at the table, they're just gonna like always be, negative about anything you want to do. So like, there's a, there's a building in Lancaster that I'm actually really glad that they saved. But it was like on a secondary street, like in an alley behind, like it was like, I didn't know if I would have put up the fight, that the people did. And I'm like, they are much more committed than I am. But they saved it, and now it's a really great space. And I'm glad that they saved it, but like, I just didn't know if that would have been the fight that I would have picked.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that that's like a struggle, because like I'm just thinking back, even here in Chicago, we had an incident a couple of years ago where it was the back of a building. It was, a garage unit in an alleyway, basically, but it was in a historic district.
Yeah.
And the way that the property was situated, you could kind of see the back of the house from a main thoroughfare.
Right.
But what was needed was a ramp because the person who lived in that building was in a wheelchair.
Oh, yeah.
And I think for me, I didn't see anything wrong with putting in an elevator lift or a ramp or things like that, because that is what's necessary. We want people who have disabilities to be able to live and enjoy the quality of life of being in an old building and in a walkable and accessible neighborhood. And so for me, there was some opposition to letting them do that, and
Goodness,
that's
something that could be removed. I mean, it's not something that's permanent.
Exactly. Yeah. And and I think for us to be able to stay relevant, we have to be able to acknowledge that like those kind of needs are there.
Yeah.
And we shouldn't just say, oh, well, if you can't get into this building, then you should go live somewhere else. That wasn't okay with me,
No, I agree with you. I do. I definitely agree with you. Was there anything that, as we were talking, that I didn't think to ask you about, or that maybe you thought of while we were having our conversation, that you wanted to share before we wrap up?
Other than, our reports they're all online, and they're free to download and read. So I know we kind of just like grazed the surface on a lot of these, but there's a lot of really great data, which I'm heavily involved in creating and stuff like that. So I really appreciate if you go there and look at that. And, I think also as well, it's really important for preservationists to not fight anecdotes with anecdotes, and that we actually start fighting these, small criticisms and anecdotes with actual data.
Yeah.
So I think that that's something that our reports provide, and yeah, you can see it all on our website. So
yeah, I think that there is definitely a wealth of knowledge on your website and in your reports, and I've pointed many people towards your direction. So I appreciate the work that you're doing. Besides the reports, are you doing any seminars or anything that you would like to promote?
Yeah. So my colleagues, Caitlin Cotton and Rodney Sink, will be presenting some sessions at the Florida Main Street Conference coming up in July here. And Rodney was the state Main Street coordinator for North Carolina for many years. So it's always great to hear him talk about Main Street, North Carolina, especially, which, was the city or the state that he worked in, has a really mature program. They've been around for 40 years. They've really done some great things. So that should be really worthwhile if you're in the Main Street kind of movement side of preservation. And then also on our PlaceEconomics social media channels, which is Facebook and Instagram mainly, we also post a lot of really great, like, interactive and thought-provoking content. And we actually, another one of our New Year's resolutions was to kind of start bi-weekly news roundups. So all of us are just kind of curious people, and we do a lot of reading and research on the side. Because again, I think a lot of preservationists, we treat this as a lifestyle, and that it's not just a 9 to 5, and we always want to be learning more. So we kind of decided to take that exercise that we do of gathering knowledge and creating these news roundups on Friday. So it's almost like a weekend reading list that you can view and read, and we provide the links for you. And if you want, you can also sign up to get that pushed to your inbox as well. So yeah,
I am on that mailing list. I enjoy it.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, we've got one coming out this Friday. So yeah.
I'll make sure that those links. Oh, and what is your website? Also,
our website is placeeconomics.com. And there you can, click on our resources tab, and like I said, be able to download all of our reports. You can also look back at our Place blog, which has all of our news roundups and all of the, when we get the results of the Pres polls, we post them on our Place blog as well. So yeah, that's all on our website.
Okay, well, very good. Thank you so much for your time today. I felt like I learned a lot.
Yeah, great. Awesome. Yeah, I had a great time.
Thanks for listening to the Practical Preservation Podcast. The resources discussed during this episode are on our website at practicalpreservationservices.com/podcast. If you received value from this episode and know someone else that will get value from it as well, please share it with them. Join us next week for another episode of the Practical Preservation Podcast. For more information on restoring your historic home, visit practicalpreservationservices.com.